In the time that you stood for mayor and became mayor, what was your most important mandate that you gave yourself and on which you won your ticket?
Well, I run on a pledge to end corruption in the city. It was a place in Toronto where who you knew was more important than what you knew. And we worked very hard. We brought in a lobbyist registrar. We gave our auditor more powers to ensure that people knew that if you did business with the City of Toronto, it's because you had the best product at the best price. And I think we were very successful in that. So that was the number one thing. The number two thing was Toronto is Canada's business capital. It's a tremendously successful city. It's green. It's highly integrated. It's very welcoming. It's very safe, but all of those things were fraying a bit, and we needed leadership in order to become as successful as we potentially could. And to do that, we needed to build public transit infrastructure. We had a very advanced plan. Some of it's been slowed down since I was the mayor, but we do have 2 lines under construction, a subway and an LRT. Significant investment from the national and provincial governments to do that. And that's the most infrastructure that's been built probably in 30 years. And very, very important for us, because if people can't get around a city, they can't succeed for their families, and of course business can't succeed.
The other interesting thing about Toronto is that it's a large city relative to the national economy. If you go across the border to the States, there are many cities that are small where there's a greater degree of freedom, and it is decoupled from what's happening at the federal level in a sense. So to what extent does Toronto have to, or rather does Toronto even mirrors the national politics and the national agenda on budget management, and to what extent has it been able to be independent of that?
It's a very interesting question. First of all, one simple statistic: within an hour's drive of Toronto, there's about 1 in 5 jobs in Canada. That's sort of like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Cincinnati all put together, and more in terms of impact on the U.S. It's fairly rare in the world for that much to be concentrated in one main city, and it makes a huge difference nationally and provincially. From time to time, the interests are aligned. When I was first mayor, we had a Prime Minister, Paul Martin, the Premier, Dalton McGuinty, and David Miller. They called us the 3 M's. Right. And we work together because we all recognize that Canada can succeed without Toronto succeeding. But that was unfortunately a bit rare. Traditionally, it's a bit more of a hostile relationship, particularly between the city and the provincial government. Yeah, it's for pretty simple reasons. We produce most of their tax revenue, and so from a city perspective, we think we should be making the decisions, and of course those governments think they should be. But we did have that period, and there were huge investments in Toronto, in public transit, and a number in parks, in the waterfront revitalization, very significant ones that came about because of that time, because the governments were aligned, and we worked together on common issues to solve them together.
Is there infrastructure that you actually share, like national airport, for example, where the alignment between the city and the federal government is important?
Most of the infrastructure is discrete. Pearson Airport is the national hub in Canada, very important to the economy of Toronto, but it's run by a board appointed by the federal government. The city gets 1 appointee. And even then, we don't directly appoint that person. The one piece of infrastructure that's shared by all 3 governments is our rail system. So Union Station, which is just over here, not too far from my office, the city owns. The federal government has jurisdiction over railways, and the province runs the local commuter trains called GO Transit, and our subway comes right into it. So we're working together. That's the most important transportation hub in Canada, actually. More people pass through Union Station every day than pass through Pearson Airport, and we're working together to revitalize it, to revitalize the rail infrastructure and the station. However, most things are separate, although the funding comes from all 3 governments. Most things are separate. You have provincial agencies, federal agencies, and city agencies.
In terms of securitizing your regular income, your ongoing income, and also your debt ceiling, you're fully subscribed in a sense. What are some of the checks in place to prevent a Canadian city or city council going the American way of actually securitizing it, taking it off the books, and then issuing even more debt?
Well, I think, first of all, the voters wouldn't put up with it. In Toronto, we've got a very proud heritage of being a financial centre, and it sort of seeps into everybody's lives. We're the kind of people here who always balance our checkbooks, and we expect our governments to. Secondly, city governments have to balance their budget. Thirdly, by law, your budget has to be balanced. Thirdly, in our case, we passed a ceiling that said 15% of our income is all we're going to spend on our debt. So those are all checks and balances, and these kind of off-book transactions worry me greatly, and it's one of the reasons I think people should be a little bit cautious with public-private partnerships, because they are often off-book, but in reality the government, who's the partner, in some way or other is providing an income stream. And what would that income stream go to if it wasn't going to this piece of infrastructure? It's an important question to ask. And I think we've seen some of these, like in London, England, for example, come unraveled at great cost to the public purse.
Right. But at the same time, what you pay for your debt is on the high side, isn't it? I mean, it's like you pay 5.3% yield. And
that's an average over time that you're talking about.
Given the cost of funds that are available in the market today,
if the City of Toronto issues a bond today, it gets almost the best rate possible. So at the time that the cost of funds went up to about 5%, that was quite good in the market, particularly compared to other Canadian, North American governments. And yes, there's a cost to that, but if you think about the kind of infrastructure that's paying for, and we try to use our borrowing for big infrastructure and try to pay for small infrastructure out of ongoing budgets. So the way we thought, and I think it's the right way, if this infrastructure is going to last 50 or 100 years, you borrow for it. If it's something that's small and the payback period's 5 years, then you pay for it out of current revenues. And in the private sector, you try to match the depreciated life of an asset against your financing. It's the same thing for us. And yes, of course, when interest rates go down, some of the financing was in the past, so it's a little bit more. But this year's borrowing will reflect the new lower interest rates, and the overall cost will come down. How's
the global economy affecting the city of Toronto as an economy, as well as the ability to tax, both at the consumption level as well as at the capital tax level?
We see the impacts of the global economy a little bit indirectly. Toronto itself reasonably survived the great financial meltdown. Our banks are highly regulated and well capitalized, very conservative. The banks are criticized for being conservative, and at times the government is criticized for over-regulating them, but the result was they survived the crash very well, particularly compared to our friends in the United States who had riskier practices. And that was important to our economy because the financial services sector is a big part of Toronto. So we did okay. Unemployment rose. But our building sector was thriving, partly because of significant measures we'd brought in as a city, lowering commercial taxes, lowering what are called development charges. If you build a new building, you have to pay a charge, and we charge far less than we're legally allowed to. The result is a building boom that's being sustained. However, it's not without challenges because our financial services sector supports mineral exploration. So as the world economy softens, that business softens, and we have an impact in Toronto. One of the fortunate things about Canadian cities, though, is because we're highly reliant on property tax revenue, that's pretty stable. So the city itself, from a budget perspective, we made some efficiency measures, and certain we negotiated with our employees to moderate certain benefits, for example. But we did okay, and we would like to get a share of sales tax revenue so we could support infrastructure that helps grow the economy. But on the other hand, when there's a recession, it's nice to be dependent on a stable source of revenue, which is what property tax is.